Hi Dragonflies, welcome back to Dragonfly Spirit Studio. I'm Lynn Bauer. I'm back with another Postcard Paint-Along, and in this Postcard Paint-Along we're going to deal with the situation where you go out to sketch or paint on location, but the conditions don't really permit you to get out your sketchbook and your watercolor paints. And maybe even taking photos is a little dicey. Maybe it's raining, or maybe, as in this Postcard Paint-Along, there are big waves hitting the cliff and periodically drenching everyone with spray. So we're going to use a few photos that I was able to capture in between covering up my camera with my jacket, and our imagination and memory and artistic creativity to try to create a postcard that captures a little bit of the feel of the day. Sometimes in the comments, someone will complain that one of my tutorial paintings doesn't look at all like the photograph. And at this point in my career, I just chuckle because I have no intention of making my paintings look like a copy of a photograph. But I know that early in your career, that can be really hard to hear, especially if it's coming from your own inner critic. So I'd just like to pause for a moment and remind us all that if you think about the art that you value, paintings, movies, music, books, I think that you'll realize that how accurately it reproduces some scene at some moment in time in every detail is not usually the number one thing that you look for in art that you care about. We often put a lot higher priority on things like whether it evokes an emotion or a memory, whether it tells a story, whether it allows us to see the world from someone else's perspective, or experience something that isn't immediately available to us. Yes, we all appreciate seeing skill, and yes, it's a valuable thing sometimes to try to copy details in order to learn to control the paint as an exercise. But if your inner critic is telling you that's not in the photo or that doesn't look like the photo, I hope you will claim the right to challenge that that is not the only criterion by which you're going to judge whether your painting is any good. I know I don't want to copy any of these photos exactly, because the only time I could take a photo was when waves were breaking on rocks fairly far away, but I want to create a postcard about those times when the waves broke close to us and we actually got drenched with the spray. I've used various elements from the photos and my memory to try to create a little sketch to capture the idea of the feel of the day that I want to create in my postcard, and then I'll use the photos as needed for information about shapes and textures. I'm using my usual gray mixture of a blue and a brown, in this case ultramarine blue and burnt umber, and I want my sky to be relatively pale, so I'm going to test my color on another sheet of paper, because once I get a deep puddle in my palette, it's a little difficult to tell exactly what color I have. Now we're going to create our wave, our spray, by negative painting around it. And as I often do, I am going to spritz my paper with water a little bit ahead of time. You don't have to do this, but it always helps me get that sort of ragged edge. So now I'm going to come in with my sky color, and I think I'll have my spray go right off the page in a couple of places. That will help create the illusion that it's way up in the air. And then as I come down into what will become the water, I'm going to leave some little lights here and there, some whites, to be distant spray or breaking waves. I'm not worrying too much about exactly where they are right now. I'm just making sure I leave a little bit of white. And our rocks are going to go here, so we can just kind of bring that wash right on down. When I get to this area that's going to be in between the cliff and the rocks that the spray is coming over, I think I'll leave a little more white for the rough water in that little area. And then I think I will add a little bit of the shadowing that would go in on the underside of this spray. So just kind of sweeping my brush up in the same motion that that spray might make to create some of the shadow shapes. All right, we need to let that layer dry, and then we can come back and add our water. When I'm creating a distant horizon in water in the field, I like to use a piece of tape to help me create that line quickly with just a quick sweep of the brush. But you need to make sure your paper is completely dry and burnish down this lower edge so that no paint can creep underneath. We're also going to pull this tape off right away so that we don't have time for anything to migrate underneath that edge. So now I'm basically using the same color I just used. Because it's layered on top of a previous color, it will appear a little darker. And I'm going to follow what I'm seeing. Maybe there's a little water peeking out here. And then there's this area here. And I'm just using my finger to smudge that edge and keep that edge rough. And then over here. And now I'm going to pull the tape right away so there's no opportunity for paint to creep under the edge. And now I'm going to just do pretty much the same thing I did before. I don't have to carefully paint around each of these lights. I just need to make sure I leave some and maybe some pale gray. So both of those will now work as distant spray or rough water. So simply using pretty much the same technique works as I bring this down. Now again, our rocks will go here, so I'm just going to bring that wash on down the page. And then when I get over here where this gap between the cliff and the rocks are, I'm going to make some long sort of circular or oval shaped strokes to sort of suggest that we can see some of the swirling in the water in the close areas. I'm just going to sweep up into, I've got an area that looks like spray on this side of the rocks, so I'm going to take advantage of that. If you didn't have that happen, then you might not be doing that right there. And now while this is still wet, I'm going to take a little bit of darker color and drop in some darker areas in the water and let them just blend wet into wet. Again, I'm not painting, think of this as more like creating a texture than painting any specific thing. We just want to have some detail in the foreground or some suggested detail in the foreground to kind of make it appear closer. And then as I go farther away, the shapes that I would see in the water are going to be more edge on, so they're more of a straight line, more of a horizontal line. All right, I feel myself starting to fuss and fiddle, so it's time to let that dry before we add our rocks and our distant landform. When you pause to let things dry in your watercolors, always take a moment to prop them up and step away from them and look at them from a distance, so you'll see weird things like this. This is where the tape was, and apparently I put some horizon over here, and now I have this blob up above, and that looks strange, so we want to make an adjustment to that. And you'll catch that sort of thing usually as you step away from the painting after working on it for a while. When we're working, we all tend to be laser focused on exactly where our brush is. So I'm going to just take some of my sky color and fill in a bit of that area so that it looks more like actual spray going up. And yeah, there's a little bit of a line there, but in the end, no one's going to be able to focus on that because the attention will all be somewhere else. So This has to dry before we'll know if we've got the values quite right, but I think it'll be okay. All right, now that we fixed our little boo-boo, let's go and put in our rocks. So for the rocks, I want a darker version of my same gray. And for the distant landform, I'm going to also use a darker version, but something that's a little cooler and not quite as dark as the rocks in my foreground. So for the foreground rocks, I'm going to let them lean even a tiny bit towards the brown. Warmer colors tend to come to the foreground, so that will help create the illusion that those rocks are close. Let's create our distant point. I'm just using my brush, kind of tapping the brush point along to make like a rough edge that has trees on it perhaps. I'm leaving the lower edge also a little rough to suggest that the water is rough down there. And then we have these rocks at the end of the point. So that creates our little distant point of land. I'm going to skip doing the intermediate rocks just now because I want to put in my foreground rocks and my figure so I don't accidentally put a rock right where I'd like to have my figure. So let's put in our foreground rocks, and I'm not going to try to match anything exactly. I'm not going to try to match my sketch or my photos exactly. I'm just going to create sort of that same sort of a silhouette that looks like some cliffy rocks in the foreground. Kind of moving my brush sort of randomly so that these rocks don't look too regular. And then I'm going to drop in a little clear water right along where the upper surface of these rocks might be to add a little bit of form and a little bit of kind of textural interest. Now blooms take a while to develop, so we're going to just let that do its thing while we go over here and paint our other rocks. And again, these rocks also are not some particular famous rock formation, so I'm not worrying about trying to create an exact shape. In fact, right now, I'm paying a little more attention to what I've already got going here and where there might be some opportunities to create the illusion of rough water splashing up against these rocks in the foreground. So I'm going to make these rocks be whatever shape seems appealing to me right now. And then I'm going to, on the lower edge, I think I'm going to kind of pull my brush down in the same kind of motion that I used up there and make some suggestion of rough water splashing up against the bottom of those rocks. And again, let's drop in some clear water here and there along upper parts of these rocks, what would be maybe an upper edge, and we'll let some blooms develop there. They won't be real obvious. You can see it's starting to happen here. It's just a little subtle change in the light, helps to add a little texture without having to actually paint any texture. And I think I want maybe some little bits of this rock peeking up right here. All right, again, time to let this dry, and then we'll come back and we'll put in some of these intermediate rocks and our little figure. While we're waiting for our rocks to dry, we're going to transfer the silhouette of our little figure to a piece of copy paper. I've placed the photos and sketch used as reference for this postcard paint-along on my website, and you can find the link in the video description. So you can print them out and use a sunny window to transfer, or you may be able to size things so that you can transfer directly from your computer screen, as I'm doing here. and I am simply scribbling with a pencil and filling in the entire silhouette of my figure. Don't be too particular about it. It just has to look like a figure. It doesn't have to look like this particular figure. I'm ready to transfer my little figure drawing onto my postcard, and it's a little difficult to see where my figure is going to go. You might not have noticed, but I actually, in the sketch, have the figure facing in the other direction. So I'm going to be placing this face down, and it's hard to tell where I'm putting it. So to solve that problem, what I do is I come in and I cut right at the bottom of the figure's feet. Actually kind of cut his feet off, I think. And then I'm going to cut right along this edge. So that will leave me enough to hang on to, and I can also tell much better where I'm putting my figure. I can use those two edges to line things up. I think I want him right about there. Now I'm going to take a gel pen or a ballpoint pen so that I have that harder point, and I'm going to carefully scribble on the back. I want to make sure I don't scribble over onto my postcard. And as I do this, the graphite is transferring. It's a very ghostly image. You may not be able to see it really well on the video, but you'll be able to see it in person. So now, even though that doesn't show up very well on video, I can see it well enough that I can use it as a guide now to paint my little figure. All I'm painting is the silhouette. I'm not painting any details in my figure. One thing to keep in mind as you're adding figures like this is the figure is not the main subject of this postcard. The main subject of this postcard is the big spray coming up over the rock. The figure is there for scale, and also because it will help direct the viewer's eye. We have a tendency to look wherever a figure in the painting seems to be looking. So I'm going to just make a little dot for his head, and then I'm going to make his shoulders by scribbling my brush back and forth. And then I'm going to just sort of fill in the silhouette just as I did with my pencil. And that's all I'm going to do, because his only job is to show you the scale of things and to help you have a human presence to kind of direct your gaze. Now I'm going to put in those intermediate rocks where I know that I'm not going to accidentally cover up where my figure might go. So let's look and see. Here's a place that it looks like there might be some spray flying up. We can put a rock there. As I put in these intermediate rocks, I'm also going to put in some of the darker shapes in my water that will help connect things to the rocks. Let's see, let's have one right here, smaller one, and maybe one right there. That's kind of a long series of rocks. So making some of these shapes of little darker areas in the water helps connect those darker shapes into the painting overall. And now as I come down into the foreground, I'm going to do the same sort of thing down here. And remember, this isn't painting any particular detail. This is just adding a little bit of a suggestion that there's detail in the foreground to help it appear more in the foreground. I feel like I want a little bit more shadow now that I have these darker shapes in, so I'm going to add a little pale additional suggestion of shadow in the spray towards the lower part of it. And a little bit maybe down here. I think it's time to pull the tape and maybe call that one done. Let's see what we think. I think I'm going to say that one's done. I'm pretty happy with that. And it tells the story better than any of the photos. And although you can still find this boo-boo if you know it was there, there's so much else for the viewer to look at that no one really notices that kind of thing. So if something like that happens to you on one of your postcards, don't think, oh no, I've wrecked it. Just make whatever adjustment you need to make and do it so that it's sort of blended in, but don't worry about trying to fix it too much, because sort of blended in is all you really need. So I hope you have a good time making crashing waves of your own, and I hope you got some ideas for what to do when none of your photos really captures the story that you would like to tell about your day in the field. I'll see you next time. Happy painting!